Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us for the World Building Mythology and Folklore panel. My name's Samuel Hale, and I'm joined by C.H. Hung, Sarah J. Sover, James Merrill, John Kimpson, and Michael Scott. So thank you to everyone for making time today. Got a couple questions we're going to be going over just as a heads up. Instead of saying world building, mythology, folklore every single time, I'm just going to start with world building at this point and keep it there. So I've got a number of questions. All of you are bringing a lot of expertise into this area. So I'd like to start with Sarah, and we'll go around the table, as it were, and ask the same question of everybody. So starting with Sarah, and then we'll move on to James for this same question and go around. Sarah, what are some implications that need to be considered when creating mythology folklore to deepen your world building?
I think that really depends on how you're implementing it. A mythos that your characters subscribe to is going to be an entirely different set of considerations than if you're writing within the mythology. For example, I tend to use folklore and fairy tale creatures
Hmm.
as characters in my story. So I need to consider how environment and plot dovetail with those existing aspects of the characters that people are expecting to be there. But there's an entirely different set of considerations if
Hmm.
you're creating a mythological system for characters to subscribe to. For example, you might want to consider how devout your main characters are, how much their beliefs impact their everyday lives, and how much that mythology impacts their social structures, among a lot of other things. One of my favorite books for this is Watership Down. I love that it's so well researched on rabbit behavior. It's a bunch of rabbits, traversing the countryside looking for a new place to live. But they also have all of their own mythology, with Lord Frith and the Prince of the Rabbits and all of these allegories and parables that help them make decisions, which is really cool how it's so well integrated with the actual science of animal behavior.
Great. All right, James, same question for you. What are some implications that need to be considered when creating mythology, folklore to deepen your world building?
Well, most definitely, I loved everything Sarah had to say. It talking about favorite books. Jim Butcher is one of my favorite. He does the Dresden Files. I kind of use him as a template. He goes over customs, religious beliefs. His books are very good. I like to on our particular project, which is a comic book called Me and Mr. Jones. We have a vampire, so we like to, excuse me, not include the general stereotypes such as garlic and crosses and things like that. So we try to build off of creating our own things that go with him, that he's able to survive in the sunlight and things like that.
Mhm.
Trying to make sure that you surround this your characters with other characters that have like beliefs, and you set up a structure. Maybe it's a society structure for these characters. That's the most important thing. Customs that they follow day to day, and kind of a mantra of what they like to do.
Yeah, I like the idea of just getting away from certain tropes in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not that all tropes are inherently bad, but that there's always ways to do some gymnastics with them that's still interesting while playing into the parts that are inherently interesting as well.
Absolutely. That's very important in world building and creativity.
Hmm.
You just don't want to sometimes do the
Yeah.
same old.
Well, especially from the writing point of view, it's also fatiguing
Mhm.
for the writer. Thanks for your answer, James. All right.
No problem.
Cindy, what are some implications that need to be considered when creating mythology, folklore, and world building?
I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about mythology and folklore is Sarah touched upon this earlier of how devoutly characters and people believe in their myths and folklore. That sets up some really interesting opportunities for conflict when you have groups that don't necessarily follow the same beliefs
Hmm.
or who aren't as devout or who have evolved to believe a slightly different set of those mythologies and folklores. So I think it really creates these possibilities for power struggles based around these myths and folklore that can really create these interesting story arcs. So yeah, I think you need to think about too which mythologies and which folklores perhaps might be more dominant in your world building, and how that influences the rest of the mythologies and folklores in your world.
That's a good point to make. What's kind of dominating it and how you're going to either integrate it or eschew it, either for, again, for the writer's sanity as well as for the reader's enjoyment. That's a good point to make. Thank you. John, so same question to you. What are some implications that need to be considered when creating mythology and folklore to deepen world building?
Yeah, so piggyback off of James, our comic book, me and Mr. Jones, we deal with a lot of mythical creatures. So like our main characters, like the movie monsters, like Frankenstein, werewolf, and they're the kids of those monsters. So the thing we're implicating in is we're going through every culture with their myths and monsters. So we have to do a lot of research and make sure that it matches with that culture.
Mm-hmm. Make sure you have that authenticity going on. I totally understand. Especially now, we want to make sure that we're paying homage as well as being authentic to who and what we're pulling from.
Right. I don't want to insult anybody.
Right, right. Thank you, John. Michael, same question. What are some implications that need to be considered when creating mythology, folklore to deepen world building?
I guess the main thing for me is staying true to whatever it is we're building. As John and James have both said, we're taking a unique stance with the diversity.
Uh-huh.
Doing monsters. Every country, every ethnicity has their own group of legends or folklore or things that are indicative to them. So as we try to implement and bring those things in, we do kind of want to do our own thing, but still have it based in that folklore, so those people from the different backgrounds can identify with it. So it's important to kind of keep in mind the source material, but put our own spin on it and still keep the diversity in play also.
Yeah, I think that's one of the trickiest parts is how do you use the source material but still make it your own in the process, which I think a lot of writers, whether you're writing something like historical fiction, for example, which is what I do, sometimes I find that I sound too much like a historian and it doesn't end up sounding like myself. So that's a really strong insight. I appreciate that. All right. So, James, we're going to start with you here and kind of piggybacking off of what we were discussing here. What kinds of mythological cliches or stereotypes do you try to avoid in your world building?
Let's see, in our world building, we try to make sure that we don't pretty much go through, I'd say, deities. We try not to get into, whether it's monotheism, polytheism, things like that. We try to avoid class systems or anything like that that doesn't, as Mike had said before, and John, we're trying to promote diversity, trying to bring our characters to more of a equal footing with each other, as well as a race and religion. We touch on it, but don't preach it, if you get my meaning.
Yeah.
So those are the types that we try to avoid.
And maybe yourself, John and Michael can speak to this a little bit more. In lieu of adding some of those cultural beliefs and values, do you supplement them with your own? Is there something you either substitute or do you just kind of maybe allude to those, but just don't make it a big part of the story?
You know something? We try to supplement as much as we can. I'm trying to think of an exact example of it, but it's escaping me right now. I think I'll think a little bit more on this and
Sure.
come up with what I need to tell you.
Yeah, no rush. All right, Cindy, same question here. What kinds of mythological cliches or stereotypes do you try to avoid in your world building?
Well, having grown up in the States, it's hard to avoid the influence of the big mouse. So I personally am a little bit tired of the princess narrative. So I don't write a lot of princess stories, not a lot of damsel in distress. And for me personally, I love the original source material, like the darker fairy tales and the lessons from those fairy tales. And so I like going back to the source material for that. But yeah, when it comes to the damsel in distress and the princess narratives, I'm a little over them right now.
Yeah, I think most of us are. Thank you for that. Okay, John, what kinds of mythological cliches or stereotypes do you try to avoid in your world building?
I watch a lot of sci-fi. So in my world building, I always try to think outside the box, try to bring something new and different and try to mix it all together so it doesn't seem like it's the same boring story, living in a town, small town, or that Spider-Man, Peter Parker always dealing with being a superhero and dealing with family life, or try to keep it like because like I said, I'm influenced by sci-fi, how they with aliens, and I like aliens and space travel and that kind of world. Because in space you never know what you're going to meet out there, so it's not the same
Right.
stuff that we do every day.
Sarah, what kinds of mythological cliches or stereotypes do you try to avoid in your world building?
So I think tropes aversion is one of the most fun things to do in writing. So there's not a lot as far as cliches or tropes that are completely off the table for me. The only thing I do try to do is avoid any aspects that might be sacred or reductive to, especially to a culture that is not my own. Like James said, I loved the touch on but don't preach on certain things.
Yeah.
That was great. But like I'm never gonna write a voodoo priestess stereotype
Hmm.
because there's no way from me. I'm a white woman from Michigan. I'm not going to be able to capture the nuance and spirituality of a culture that is so different than my own, and
Mm.
I don't want to disrespect it in any way,
Sure.
which is really kind of funny considering I write dark humor. It's not really what you'd expect me to say probably, especially since some of my stuff has been called irreverent. But if I'm going to be offensive, I want to do it on purpose, you know? I don't want to I'm I'm not writing to hurt people. That's not what my goal is here. So, but like I said, if as far as the cliches and tropes that are not hurting anybody, they're all fair game for me.
All right. So, Cindy, we're going to start with you. What are good ways to utilize myths and folklore in your storytelling? Like the actual practical use of it, whether it's in the prose, plot structure, etc.
I think first and foremost, you start with what appeals to you. As as we all were growing up, digesting stories, there was something about those myths and folklore that appealed to you, and I would go back into figuring out what it is that you loved about a particular story or a particular myth that you keep revisiting. So for me, like I really enjoyed some of the myths and folklores that had parables, stories, morality stories behind them, because I don't know, maybe I'm just a little bit sadistic that way, but I always felt like the stories about comeuppance were really fun. For example, or characters who were too stupid to live and didn't live. So, going back and figure out what appeals to you and then incorporating that emotion or that style or that tone into your writing, I think that comes most from your authentic self. I also think that there's a lot of tropes that you can find in folklore that you can bring in and sort of put your own flavor and your own style into it. So, for example, the trickster personality is common among many different mythologies. The Chinese have one, for example, and obviously the Norse have one that everyone's familiar with in Loki, and the Native Americans have Coyote. And so, if that type of trope or personality or character type is something that appeals to you, bringing that in and then injecting your own style and your own prose and your own flavor into it and putting a spin on it, and then that obviously gives you a chance to develop your own new trope, hopefully.
Yeah, great example, the coyote. Well, thank you for that. And I just want to make a note for listeners. Michael was having some audio issues, so he will not be able to join us for the rest of the panel here. So we will move on to John. What are some good ways to utilize myth and folklore in storytelling?
Like I said, with research and finding a character that you relate to, I think the reason why I like the old school movie monsters because they were always the bad guy, misunderstood, and always had died in the end. So I think when you relate to that, like, so that's what's going on with social justice and the world around us with all this things happening, it's good sometimes to implement that stuff into your story, even though we try to escape from it.
All right. Sarah, what are good ways to utilize myth and folklore in storytelling?
I would say to enrich your societies, and especially in sci-fi fantasy. In my book, Double Crossing the Bridge, I have a group of trolls with their own folk tales surrounding how the feud between goats and trolls began. And each family has their own take on it too. And it adds that kind of level of ridiculousness, but it also adds depth because when you think about it, any humanoid type species is going to have stories and beliefs, and having them be a part of the narrative really does add depth. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to ask you, you can't bring it up. What are some of the, at least one example, some of the folklore myths between the two warring species you've mentioned? I'm kind of curious now.
Oh, you got to go have me go off script, man.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
um, let's see. Actually, my trolls get into a fight about it in the bar. One of my trolls is saying that it's all began when there was some issue with them trying to cross the canyon without, of course, your standard Billy Goat's gruff. And someone else is like, "Oh no, man, that's not how it happened. You see, what happened was," and they have this whole like one-up kind of thing happening until it turns into a brawl in the bar. I'm trying to remember the specifics, but I only wrote it, so I don't know how I would possibly remember
So
that.
you've got trolls trolling trolls and starting mythological stories in a pub
Oh
with
yeah.
plenty of alcohol, I assume. So you've pretty much got all the main ingredients for a story that'll continuously evolve and cause more and more violence in the future.
Right, and if I ever get around to writing the sequel, it actually dives into the true story of how that happened.
Well, that's even better.
So that's why I don't want to reveal too much, but
Well,
we're
I
not there yet.
enjoy that kind of meta level storytelling where people go, "Well, why is that?" And then you end up writing a novella or something about it. That's always enjoyable. Great. Thanks for that. So, going back around here, here's a question I like to ask fellow world builders, and it also, I think maybe it kind of comes out of left field. We'll see how you handle it. Let's start with John. What parts of world building do you know, but that never enter your story?
Religion.
It's one of the things I and the reason I ask this, and I should preface with this, is like I always tell people when I'm talking about world building, you should know how people, if there's magic in your world and it's relatively common, you should know how people can bake cookies in your world using magic. It may never
Right.
show up in the story, but what are some elements in your world as far as the mythology, the world building itself that might be there that people never even hear, see, or read about in your stories?
Probably, I believe, would be cultures, because you don't really know about a lot of people's cultures. So that's one of the things in our story that we want to explore, because we have our main character who goes to different locations where there's different cultures. Like he might be in Hawaii, and you see the different cultures of the Polynesians, because they have different. Like you have Samoa, you have, I can't think of the. I think they're. I don't want to insult them, but I think Tongas. But they're different islands with different people with different cultures. Some of their beliefs are the same. A lot of it's different. So we get to explore that.
Thank you. All right. So, Sarah, what are parts of your world building that you know, but that never enter your story?
So I know all about all of my social, economic, religious systems, and most of it doesn't enter the story.
Hmm.
But I know what their natural resources, the societies are depending upon. I know how all these backstories of how things came to be they were the way they are. I know who made the caverns that my trolls live in.
Hmm.
But the thing is, some of it does end up filtering into the story if I'm doing my job right, because my characters are not existing in a vacuum. So it's important to know these things because you'll find once you do, when you're writing some of the dialogue, it'll just kind of pop out occasionally here or there.
Mhm.
Not all of it, of course, not big expositions about it. Yeah, I've got notebooks. I've got notebooks filled with things because my memory is not very good. So
I call it the bank. I have a folder for every story I write, and it's just called the bank, where I deposit all the things that'll probably never make it into the story. And periodically, I will make a withdrawal from the bank for something like that.
I've got a whole calendar because I wrote a magical serial killer that works by lunar cycles is my current book that I'm shopping out there right now.
Cool.
And I've got the whole calendar with all of the lunar events. Every quarter moon is charted through the years that this takes place, and it's messy.
Let's see. I'm sorry, James. What parts of your world building do you know, but that never enter the story? Or I should clarify by this point, maybe just bubble up to the surface a little bit.
This is a fun question because I can honestly say nothing. I basically, or when the guys and I are together, but for me specifically, I go about building this world. I go about, assigning, who is in charge, who's the underlings, what they believe in, everything. And, I keep that in a Bible as well
Hmm.
for the particular story, but it is within deep intent to use either use currently or use eventually. I don't know if I would worry about anybody baking anything on this particular island that I'm, creating. But that is, I mean, because I thought that was hilarious. But I just like Sarah said, you create some of these things and you go back to the bank and withdraw it, a little later.
Mm-hmm.
And but wow, that's a good one. I would have to say I try to include or eventually will include each and everything that I try to do.
Mm-hmm.
Being creating the characters, like we created a island of women sirens, and we went left right on it. We talked about how they got to be sirens, how they were not accepted by mankind, what makes, how do they procreate, maybe that's it. We probably never tell the procreation part
Yeah.
because that probably won't be acceptable. But we went over what they eat, kind of. We were kind of just sitting talking, and that's what we do best. Is we sit, we talk, we suppose and surprise ourselves with our answers and come up with what we want. So all those suppositions are not on a recorded tape anywhere, and everything that we want to use is.
Yeah. I think like you mentioned just a moment ago, surprising ourselves with our answers is probably, I'm sure everybody here can agree, is probably one of the most enjoyable parts of writing. And
Yes.
by virtue, the most surprising is when you find out, wow, I had no idea my world had that thing until one of my characters told me.
Right. Can I throw in a little quick one of the questions that you asked before?
Oh, of course.
Try to believe about good ways to utilize myths and story in folklore and storytelling.
Sure.
We have kind of we deal with a vampire on our specific book, and we try to do something other than the classic stereotypes, the garlic, the crosses, and all that. One big one is having fangs, and is there necessary blood consumption?
Mm-hmm.
We've basically turned our vampire into a vegetarian of sorts, where that's not necessarily what he consumes. Life force or even vegetables. Even we tried to do something other than the classic and just kind of change it up so that we don't have anything. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Sure.
Kind of like Monsters Inc., where
Mm.
they have laughs instead of screams,
Oh,
and
yeah.
also just try to turn some of these things around about these classic stereotypes and all that. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Sure. I think if I were to do vampires, I'd probably stick to humans for blood, but you'd have to make sure it was farm to table. That would be my thing.
Farm to table.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Farm to table. All right.
Yeah.
So let's see. Cindy, same question. What parts of your world building do you know, but that never or hardly enter your story?
Well, I'm kind of with Sarah here in the sense that I I sort of need to know everything to inform the way the characters are driving the story and to figure out how the plot will naturally evolve from there. I'm a discovery writer by nature, or a pantser, if you will.
Right.
So I'm often world building as I go. What often happens is I'll run into a problem or a something that needs to be described, and I'll have to sit back and think about, okay, let me walk this back. How does this happen? Why does this happen? Why are these characters acting the way they are? And so one of the things that I find most often I have to think about is my characters' belief systems. And whether that is, religion or politics or the superstitions that their family endowed them with, whatever informs that belief system is how they're going to be motivated, how they're going to react to situations, and what's going to build their goals and their needs and their wants. And so I have a critique partner, for example, who she just wrote this epic fantasy that's gorgeous and lush, and her magic system is so incredibly detailed, and the organization that runs the magic system, if you will, is so complex. It's almost like a government in itself. So one of the things that we mentioned to her was, your magic system is almost like a religion, because of how pervasive it is in this world that she's built. And you don't necessarily, see it. You don't see like the Vatican doing their thing, but in this world, the magic and the people running the magic are everywhere, and they're affecting the characters at all turns. I'm currently writing a historical fantasy set in 1950s McCarthy era America, and there's a lot of political conflict in that type of setting.
Of course.
And each and every character has a political belief, even if they don't know it. And so I have to know what each character believes, even if the characters don't know. And, even if they don't say something in a scene, the choice to not say something is a statement and a reflection of their belief in itself.
Mm.
I think a lot of times you don't necessarily see people's belief systems and political beliefs on the page, but you know that it's underneath and it's driving everything that they're doing.
That's a really good point, that most every, if not all, characters, just like people in real life, have some kind of political belief or view, and it can't not seep into the story somehow. So even if it's happening on a subversive level and we're not explicitly mentioning it, it's still there. That's a really strong point to make. Cindy, have you altered the mythology, folklore in your stories to accommodate the plot?
Absolutely. I actually wrote a short story that came out not too long ago, based in a mixture of mythologies. And the main character is a character from Norse mythology, and the setting happens, or the story happens post Ragnarok, post COVID-19, post, like everything just, the crap hits the fan in all sorts of different ways. And obviously, there's not a lot of Norse mythology, that deals with what happens after Ragnarok. So I'm gonna make it up. And I had a lot of fun with it because I, did my research to figure out, okay, well, and the character I chose is not one that's popular in Norse mythology. So there wasn't a lot of source material to draw upon, and what there was conflicting, of course, because there's lost texts about this character. So I sort of just had to piece together what made sense to me for this character to work. So yeah, that's what I did for that story. For me, I come from a Chinese diaspora background, and my mom is one of the most superstitious people you'll ever meet in your life. And she grew up in a rural fishing village. And so I grew up with a ton of folklore stories from her background. And now, as I'm older, as I'm going back and diving into the stories that she used to tell, pass down to me, I don't have the source material for that, obviously. But what I do is I think about what appealed to me about her stories, and I take it and I meld it together with the stories that I grew up with here in the States, and combine it into something that is both Eastern and Western flavored, if you will. And that way I come up with something that's fresh and new and is unique to me. So yeah, I've definitely twisted some folklore from my own background
Mhm.
to make sure it works for the plot.
Thank you. John, have you altered your mythology or folklore in your stories to accommodate the plot?
Yes, like I said, with ours is like the main characters like the movie monsters. So we have their children, so they don't have the same stereotypes there as their parents being chased. So the world is more they're more like us, but they just have those abilities of where they can control their changing from, like, for example, the werewolf. He looks like a normal kid, but when you look at him, he kind of looks like a wolf, but he don't look like a wolf.
Hmm.
But he's able to change into a wolf on his own accord, not because the moon comes out.
All right, thank you. Sarah, have you altered your mythology or folklore in your stories to accommodate your plot?
So I usually combine established characters and mythologies with original ones. So I haven't really encountered any kind of situation where I felt the need to alter, although I do embellish a lot.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that is a draw for me to write with these different aspects of mythology and folklore is working with the familiar, but then that level of mysticism and mystery gives you the freedom to run with it a little bit and to blur some things. I tend to be a story first writer, so I'm writing my story and then I might use some aspects of mythology and folklore where it works. But I feel like if I'm going to change it too much, it's almost forcing it. So I try to be a little bit organic with it, but of course, different things work for different stories.
Mhm.
So
Well, I think the key word you said earlier is embellish too, not necessarily altering, but just going deeper and perhaps exploring themes or ideas within folklore that haven't been touched on or maybe have been lost because there were oral storytelling traditions. So I think embellish is a really appropriate way of putting it.
exactly, and it's a lot of fun to sometimes give reason for the things that, especially when you're dealing with like monsters. I love getting in the head of monsters
Mhm.
and giving reasons for the behaviors and the things that we know are integral parts of what they are that might not be the most expected way to go.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. James, have you altered your mythology or folklore in your stories to accommodate the plot?
Absolutely. But before I say anything on this, I think that Sarah and Cindy are going to be my new favorite novelists. I can't wait to look your stuff up and check it out. Yes, John and I, as well as Mike, have all, when we're usually sitting down, there are times that we are not together. And so we come up with different things that we want to do. We all like sci fi as well as monsters. And so we kind of found a way to bring that together and kind of stay true to both sides of it. At one point, we have sci fi monsters fighting regular, normal monsters that we're used to every day. We try to stay away from a lot of the tropes and situations that, exist in folklore and mythology. We try to map out the characters so that we know what their likes and behavior will be. We try to make sure, just as I mentioned in the previous question, make sure that we take, for a vampire, we get away from him, sucking blood every other page,
Hmm.
and try to keep him towards another form, life forces, and what do you call it? What was the other thing? It was more of an erotic nature on one, but we X that because that's not PG-13.
Yeah.
So mostly those things that you try to make sure that the story is rich. And as I believe it was Sarah was saying, you wind up writing the story more or less and trying to fit in what folklore and mythological things that you have into that. And most important is trying to get the creativity of the story and making it different than anything else is most important. So that's usually the first thing.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. It's very insightful, James. Coming back around to you, James, you'll be going first here. So, this kind of piggybacks as well on the previous question. So, James, what kinds of spins have you taken on mythological figures that's contrary to how they were originally portrayed? So, what are things you do that more or less fly in the face of mythology and folklore that you really lean into?
Wow, you got me on that one because it's almost everything that I just said. Uh, Let's see. John had kind of touched on the creatures that we create. They more or less have a human form, and they're just not just in this creature form all the time. We try to make sure that the kids have a normal life, that they hit high school. I can say that the movie, Teenage Werewolf, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, that, with Michael Landon, that, he was in school, but so that's not really flying in the face of, but we kind of return to something that presents normalcy and that can actually provide interesting stories as we go into society and what's going on in society, making these kids normal. What else can I think? The vampire not consuming blood, as well as invoking in sci-fi, as well as into some of these situations with these deities that we have. We have one deity, a yeti, that is, more or less seen as a monster. The people around them, is in the Himalayas, and they worship him on a mountain. But he comes down and he talks. It's all this. It's not just all this screaming and yelling and I'm gonna get you. It's hey, what's the problem? So we're enjoying that. We're enjoying flipping things on its head and seeing what we can do as a twist to them.
Great. All right, Cindy, same question. What kinds of spins have you taken on mythological figures that's contrary to how they were originally portrayed?
Well, I wrote a story about a dragon, and I know in Western cultures, a dragon is a very particular type of creature. I remember being in grade school and reading about St. George and the Dragon, for example, and that's the type of dragon I grew up with. But I also grew up with my mom telling me the story of the Chinese Zodiac race, and I loved that story. I love astrology, but in particular, I love that story just because there is a trickster in it, as I was talking about tricksters earlier, and that's the rat. And so that story typically centers on the rat, but I took that story and wrote it from the perspective of the dragon character. And in Chinese mythology, dragons are water creatures. They're not fire creatures. So that probably wouldn't surprise someone who's familiar with Chinese mythology, but from someone who is used to the Western trope of the dragon, that was different. So that's how I twisted that story a little bit, to write it from the dragon's perspective and from an Eastern dragon.
Yeah.
I also am working on a story with the Chinese fox spirit, and they're called Hulijing, but people might be more familiar with the Japanese version, which is Kasune. And I know they've cropped up a lot recently. I think there's one in Lovecraft Country. I've not seen the series yet, so but people have told me there's one there. And I know, they're typically portrayed in sort of this almost succubus format, a seductive, demonic creature. And when you dig into the source material and the old texts that talk about fox spirits, they can actually be portrayed both ways, both good and evil. And it's actually not until they got imported, the mythology was imported to Japan and morphed into the Kasune, that they became more of a bad, villainous persona. So, yeah, in my current work in progress, I've twisted it into the spirits being more protectors, guarding villages, the way they would guard a den, for example, and making it a more positive portrayal and not necessarily just a seductive femme fatale.
All right, John, what kinds of spins have you taken on mythological figures that's contrary to how they were originally portrayed?
Like I said, we deal with the old school movie monsters. So the spin is they have intelligence, they have families. So it's not that old stereotype where the monster shows up, kidnaps a girl, hold her hostage, and the village comes after them. So yeah, that's our spin is, like I said, they're more diverse. They have cultures, they have families. Like my favorite movie monster was the creature from the Black Lagoon. I don't know why, but I just like that character. So we have a character called Gil, and we base him off of that. And he comes, he's like a race from Atlantis, lives under the sea, has a whole family. He's royalty, so it's a different spin in that way.
Cool. Sarah, same question. What kinds of spins have you taken on mythological figures that's contrary to how they were originally portrayed?
Well, my most recent book is called Fairy Godmurder, and it follows a fairy godmother and Doc Martens with a vendetta. And she's more of a Jessica Jones style fairy godmother.
You can pretty much
Um, and-
stop there at that point. You've already answered the question sufficiently.
well, I've got more. um, I've also written, other than, of course, my trolls who are sympathetic and social, which I used to satirize some of the issues plaguing humanity. I will never get over the people who keep telling me that they relate to one of my awful characters, Philip, because he is such the stereotypical nice guy, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
And he's awful. And I have had so many men approach me and be like, I hate when you're mean to Philip because I relate to him. And I'm like, oh, okay, bye. um, but I've also written carnivorous fairies, bumbling knights, and sea creatures just trying to get by in a world where boats need smashing. So
Excellent. Let's see. So, Sarah, we're just going to start with you now. Do you have any tips on creating myths and folklore for your novels, your stories, your fictitious worlds, specifically your myths, your mythology that you're creating?
say do it with intention, which is really funny because I'm a total pantser. I thought that Cindy was describing my process over there when she was talking. Um, but the thing is, I tend to write my story first and then I go through the revision process and I see what I've done and why. And I kind of dissect it as I go and build it up from there. But I would say definitely research, especially if you're working with other cultures and things like that. Make sure you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. But at the same time, let it be organic too. So it's kind of a balance, I think.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree with that. All right. James, do you have any tips on creating myths and folklore for fictitious worlds?
Yes. I basically am more of writing the story first and then fleshing out my main characters. And once I've got those fleshed out, that's when I dig into a culture and try to research it. I'm currently digging into Chinese culture. I'm not an expert at all, but I take certain things that I think will be good to build upon and express things that I want to express to my readers. And from there, I map out that entire culture and the people in it. And if I have any villains or good people within it, I establish those characters and make sure that they portray what they're supposed to portray during the story. It's not a long or drawn out process, but it's trying to make sure that I stay true to the story as well as the culture and have everybody happy within it.
Right. All right. Cindy, same question. Do you have any tips on creating myths and folklore for fictitious worlds?
So I can't speak to this personally because I'm not a plotter. But what I've heard from my plotter friends is that sometimes the idea of world building gets overwhelming because they feel like they have to build the entire world all at once, even though, Rome was not built in a day and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my tip, my one tip is to pick the one thing that excites you about writing in this world and then build that and then build from there. So, for example, I have a friend who starts with the creation myths, so she writes out for each of the groups of people in that world what their creation myths are. And that helps inform how, those people operate, what their belief systems are, et cetera, et cetera. I have another friend who she loves to build, for example, the societies, whether it's going to be a communal society or an individualistic society or a matriarchal society or a patriarch, whatever that society looks like, she starts with there. And then she figures out, okay, what kind of stories would produce a society like this? So, yeah, I would say just pick one thing, build that out, and then go from there, sort of like the snowflake method.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Whether you're pantsing or you're like me, kind of a hybrid pantser outliner, I started with the Epic of Gilgamesh and worked forward, but also had an end point of where the Roman Empire was by a certain point, or the Roman Republic, I should say. So I totally agree with you. Regardless of your preferred method of writing, it's good to at least have a starting point. So, John, do you have any tips on creating myths and folklore for fictitious worlds.
Well, I agree with James and CH about that. To add to it, also, I think you should like life experience,
Hmm.
like all the stuff you saw growing up and reading about. That helps build your world because you can combine all that stuff together.
Mhm.
So I use a lot of Star Trek and Marvel comics to help build my world.
You've chosen solid source material. Are you talking Next Generation? Which Star Trek?
All of it, from the first one all the way.
Okay. I'm a Deep Space Nine guy myself, so
And two, that's my favorite.
it's best.
Yay, yay.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a different concept. Let's just have a static thing and bring the mountain to us. It's a great idea. All right. Starting with you, John, in studying mythological figures, how much of the virtues, the values in these stories and these people do you think holds true today? In other words, does the mythology we use in our stories, or that we even continue to tell today, is it still relevant?
Yeah, because like I said, with the monster characters, they were always in situations where they were the hated one, or always running or hiding from people. And we have that in society today, where people are picked on, bullied, and they're misunderstood. Instead of getting to know who they are or what they're about, they're judged by their appearance.
Yeah, seems like it's pretty consistent throughout history.
Yeah, I tell my kids all the time is that the only thing that changed about people in history is the technology. People are the same all throughout history.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Sarah, same question. In studying mythological figures, how much of their virtues and values hold true today?
That's a huge question because there's so much out there
Mm.
on the mythology and folklore front. Some are going to hold up and some won't. If we're talking Greek mythology, it's probably going to skew more towards not, in my opinion. And Medusa pops into my mind. Her being portrayed as a monster is absolute crap. She's an abuse victim of the gods before she was beheaded by Perseus. So, that said, I do agree with John that there are some universal issues that don't go away, that we can still continue to draw on today. So, yeah, it really depends on which one you're talking about.
I'd after a lot of studying of Greek and Roman mythology too, I'd hardly call Zeus beneficent as far as gods go. He's kind of the big daddy, but he's a horrible father. He's a horrible father.
And most of them are.
Yeah, they really are. The patriarchs in these mythological pantheons tend to be pretty awful, quote unquote, people. James, same question to you. In studying mythological figures, how much of their virtues hold true today?
Oh my goodness. I want to say all of them. All of it. Everything is all of the source material just kind of stays with us. And just with what Sarah said, thinking about that, it's just think about that and what John said. Sometimes a lot of this sounds like it came from somebody's real life story.
Mm-hmm.
The way they fashion the gods, the way, these are stories we kind of hear now. They're not powerful people, but, we still hear these stories. So I'd have to say yes,
Yeah,
for sure,
yes.
and leave it there.
Thank you. All right, Cindy,
Mhm.
same question. In studying mythological figures, how much of their virtues and values hold true today?
Oh gosh, so much. I think that's one of the reasons why we keep coming back to folklore and mythology for story inspiration is because their messages and their morality tales are so applicable to what we're going through today. I
Mhm.
think about, for example, the Pied Piper, that ancient, well, it's not ancient, it's Middle Ages, Germanic myth, and how that got turned into a meme about freelancing and how you should be paying your freelancers.
Hmm.
you know, Talk about reusing an old myth for current values and current struggles. And Sarah brought up Greek mythology. The one mythology that I absolutely it still infuriates me is the Cassandra myth.
Hmm.
It's about a woman who isn't believed. And you think about how applicable that is in today and the topics that we're talking about today, with raising the voices of women and the Me Too movement. I mean, that's Cassandra all over again.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think absolutely there is a ton of things that we still get from mythology and folklore, and that's one of the reasons why we keep writing about it.
Totally agree with you. All right, last question for everyone on the panel here, starting with Cindy. And if you need a minute to think about this, take all the time you need. Favorite mythological figure and or culture you've written about and why?
Might be a little bit surprising. But my favorite one so far, and I keep trying to find other favorites because I'm so embarrassed by this, is werewolves.
Sure.
I freaking love werewolves. And I think it's because I was introduced to White Wolf RPG at a very young age.
Mm.
Even right alongside D&D, and I love all the way all the clans were built out, and this idea of a communal society with packs, but there's still a kill or be killed mentality to it. I mean, it's both vicious and heartwarming, and I think that's why I love werewolves so much. I've written a lot in about werewolves. I just haven't published it because I'm not quite ready to yet. I'm still trying to figure out how I can put my own take on it and not be so cliched about werewolves. But yeah, I love them.
Yeah, it's a great, fascinating area to write about mythologically. But yeah, how do you innovate on something that at this point is already just not so much about the writer's fatigue in a lot of books, but how could you add to something that's already done so well? It's really difficult, and I think that's one thing I encounter with mythology. Certain figures, they just work the way they are. I don't want to touch it.
Yeah, it's a saturated trope for sure.
A good one, but yeah, saturated. John, favorite mythological figure and or culture you've written about and why?
I hope I'm saying this right, but my favorite mythical is the Poseidon Adventure
Mm.
because I like how he went to different places and different tasks and the different challenges he had to face with each island or adventure he went on. And I'm working on something like that right now.
You'll have to keep us appraised as you move on that. Sarah, favorite mythological figure and or culture you've written about and why?
So I'm basically a goldfish. Um, how I feel and what I am thinking right now must be how I've always felt. Um, and so it depends on what day you ask me. Right now, I just finished up doing a drawing to post up on Redbubble of my baby Kraken, and I'm a little in love with him. I wrote a short story. It starts off in your typical on board a ship, and there's sea shanties and all kinds of tales about the Kraken attacks that have been happening, but then it switches over a point of view, and it's really a mother kraken who is out for revenge, and all she wants to do is sink this ship with the person who killed her mom on it, but her baby Bip keeps getting in the way. She's making her ascent, and then all of a sudden he gets like swept away in her current, and he's like mama, and she has to abandon her attack. And then it goes over to back to the on board the ship and what that feels like to them, and it feels like there's a kraken that's toying with them, but really she's just trying to manage this out of control baby, and I feel like it's relatable to every parent out there.
I was going to hazard a guess and say you're pulling from reality at this point.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And every time he messes up her scheme, he just looks and he's like, it was an accident. And that is both of my children.
Yeah. Great. All right. James, last question here. Favorite mythological figure and or culture you've written about and why?
I think I'm going to wind up with a lot. I don't think I can come up with a favorite. I can mention favorites. I do like the Kraken, as Sarah was talking about. We actually worked a Kraken into one of our stories we recently did. John was talking about Homer's The Odyssey with the main character that's trying to basically go through all these trials and tribulations and perils to get back to his land to reclaim his throne. That's a favorite, but I guess the one we're focusing on right now is vampires, Dracula, and there's been so many interesting things that have been part of the lore. Anything from Interview to a vampire, all the way back to black exploitation movies, going back even further to the original movies, and they provided various takes on vampires. The book that I read from Jim Butcher and the Dresden Files deals with vampires and fairy creatures and Mother Winter and the Summer Queen. All of these characters, those are my favorites, and I really like them because they bring out the imagination. They bring out many different things that can be created from, or many different offshoots that can be created from these characters, vampires especially. Those are my favorites, I'd have to say.
I think that's a great way to wrap things up, James. I appreciate you tying a nice little
Oh,
bow
thank
on
you.
that for us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sarah, James, Cindy, John, thank you so much for joining us for the World Building, Mythology, and Folklore panel. And we will now go to the post-interview questions from the audience.